Welcome back to All About RX. Today, we are breaking down the fundamentals of lipids, starting right at the beginning with their definition as hydrophobic esters of fatty acids with glycerol. Now, I know when most of us hear the word lipids, we immediately just think of dietary fats, right? But as you're about to see, these molecules are incredibly dynamic and honestly absolutely essential to how life itself functions. So here's our quick roadmap for this explainer. First up, a welcome to the lipid world. Number 2, the anatomy of a fatty acid. 3, essential and unsaturated fats. 4, the lipid classification system. And finally, number 5, chemical reactions and rancidity.
All right, let's dive right into Section 1. Welcome to the lipid world, defining the basics.
Before we get tangled up in complex diagrams, we really need to anchor ourselves with that foundational textbook definition. Basically, lipids are hydrophobic esters of fatty acids with glycerol. But, what does that actually mean for their day-to-day behavior out in a chemical environment?
Well, because lipids have this remarkably high hydrocarbon content in their structure, they're inherently hydrophobic. They literally fear water. They are completely insoluble in it, which is exactly why oil and water famously refuse to mix. If you want to actually separate them from other biomolecules in the lab, you have to extract them using non-polar organic solvents, stuff like chloroform or ether. Oh, and keep in mind, their primary building blocks are those fatty acids and glycerol.
Moving on to Section 2, anatomy of a fatty acid, the amphipathic molecule. Let's zoom in on those primary building blocks.
This brings us to a genuinely fascinating concept in biochemistry. Fatty acids are amphipathic. This basically means they have a dual identity. On one end, they've got this hydrophilic or water-loving polar carboxylic head. But on the other end, they're dragging along a long, hydrophobic, non-polar hydrocarbon tail. It's this exact split personality that completely dictates how they interact with their environment.
So a crucial point here, and honestly a really helpful tip if you're taking notes for an exam, is that naturally occurring fatty acids almost always have an even number of carbon atoms. The ones you'll see the most are 16 and 18 carbons long. Think of things like palmitic acid with 16 carbons or oleic acid with 18.
Okay, Section 3, essential and unsaturated fats, structure and diet. Let's shift our focus to the actual chemical bonds holding these chains together.
We can clearly contrast the two main types of chains we're dealing with. Saturated fatty acids are essentially straight chains. They contain only single bonds between the carbons, meaning their carbon skeleton is, well, saturated. It holds the absolute maximum possible amount of hydrogen. Unsaturated fatty acids, on the other hand, contain one or more double bonds in that chain, which naturally means they have fewer hydrogens holding on.
Now this brings us to essential fatty acids, or EFAs. These are unsaturated fatty acids, like linoleic and linolenic acid, that our bodies just simply cannot biosynthesize on their own. We absolutely must get them from our diet. I really want to emphasize that linoleic acid is a true essential fatty acid here. Interestingly, if you get enough dietary linoleic acid, your body can actually use it to build other crucial molecules, like arachidonic acid.
Let's look at Section 4, the lipid classification system, bringing order to chaos. Now that we know what they look like, how do we group them?
The lipid category is a massive biomolecular family. So just to keep things from getting too overwhelming, we broadly divide them into 3 major classes. Number 1, simple lipids, like neutral fats and waxes. Number 2, compound lipids, like phospholipids and glycolipids. And number 3, derived lipids, which include steroids and fat-soluble vitamins.
Now what's really interesting here is how they break down. Simple lipids are just esters of fatty acids with an alcohol, like triglycerides. Compound lipids, however, step it up a notch. They add non-lipid groups into the mix, like a phosphoric acid residue to make phospholipids or a carbohydrate moiety to make glycolipids. And finally, we have derived lipids. These are basically the hydrolytic products of the first 2 groups, including some heavy hitters you definitely know, like steroids and your fat-soluble vitamins.
All right, let's pivot to Section 5, chemical reactions and rancidity, out of the textbook, into the lab.
So, I've got a quick question to wake you up before we look at the heavy chemistry. How do we actively test for lipids and practically utilize their unique chemical properties?
Let's slow down the pace just a bit and look at a classic laboratory detection method, the Acrolein test. This reaction detects the presence of glycerol. Basically, when you take glycerol and apply heat, along with a dehydrating agent like potassium bisulfate, or KHSO4, you physically strip away the water molecules. This dehydration synthesizes acrolein. And let me tell you, if you've ever smelled Acrolein in the lab, you know it instantly. It gives off a distinctly pungent, really acrid odor.
Another incredibly useful reaction is saponification. When you hydrolyze a neutral fat, something like a triacetylglycerol, using a strong alkali such as sodium hydroxide, the ester bonds completely break. This reaction yields glycerol and those highly useful alkali salts of fatty acids. And you actually interact with these alkali salts every single day because they are quite literally what we call soap.
Next up, let's talk about quantifying these fats. So for all the students out there cramming for exams, remember this. The iodine number is defined as the milligrams of KOH required to neutralize the fatty acids liberated from 1 gram of fat. Basically, a higher number directly indicates a higher degree of unsaturation in the fatty acid. The more double bonds present, the more halogens, like iodine, they can absorb.
Finally, let's talk about a real-world headache, rancidity. When fats are left standing in contact with air at room temperature, they eventually spoil. Oxidative rancidity happens when atmospheric oxygen actively oxidizes the fat into these really foul-smelling aldehydes. This is exactly why we use antioxidants like vitamin E to prevent that oxidative spoilage. On the flip side, hydrolytic rancidity is a slow hydrolysis that produces short-chain fatty acids, and that results in a distinctly bad taste.
And let me highlight exactly why this matters beyond just, a bad culinary experience. Rancidity doesn't just taste and smell awful. It has real clinical nutritional consequences. The process actually destroys essential dietary constituents built into the fat, wiping out vitamin A, vitamin E, and carotenoids. You are literally losing the nutritional value of the food.
Well, that brings us to the end of our lipid deep dive. Thank you so much for tuning into this explainer. If you found this breakdown helpful, please make sure to like, subscribe, and drop a comment below with any questions or topics you want covered next. See you in the next explainer.